Ark is a really fun game that consists of a lot of dull grinding. Farming resources takes up a huge chunk of time in every playthrough, so knowing strategies that can help you optimize this part of the game can make Ark so much more fun. In this video, I'll share 25 resource gathering tips and tricks that you can use to enhance your experience the next time you play Ark. Almost all of this advice works in both Ark Ascended and Ark Evolved, so there's something here for everybody. Without further ado, let's get into number 1. At number 1, I have farming river rocks. River rocks are insanely useful in the early game because they give you a higher quantity of metal per hit than normal rocks do by a huge margin. Progressing as quickly as possible towards metal tools and then metal armor to get later into the game fast is very nice because the early game of Ark can be pretty rough. You'll know it's a river rock if you look at it and it's slightly darker in tone than the other rocks in the area, and they're generally very smooth and circular. Going to metal nodes in the early game is extremely impractical because the only early game flyers that you have available to you just aren't going to be able to carry enough metal back for it to be worth your time. It's much faster to just get these river rocks, get your flak armor, get your metal tools, and then go for the higher level creatures like RGs, which can get you to that next stage of the game. At number 2, I have farming by hand more in Ark. Farming by hand is super underrated inside of this game. This is, of course, the most relevant with the mining drill, which hasn't been released to Ascended yet, but it's also extremely relevant with the chainsaw. The mining drill farms basically everything inside of Ark insanely effectively, and it comes with weight reductions on certain items. It has a 75% weight reduction to metal, stone, and wood, and the mining drill was one of the best methods to farm almost everything inside of Ark Evolved. Most importantly, on Gen 1, farming the element from the volcano with the mining drill was one of the best ways to farm element in the entire game. The only creature in Ark Evolved that was unquestionably better than using a mining drill for farming was the Tech Strider, because the Tech Strider was the strongest farming creature Ark has ever released. Besides that, the mining drill competes with every other method of farming in the entirety of the game, so there's no reason to underestimate it. The chainsaw is also an incredibly useful tool when it comes to farming. On screen now, you'll see the list of every single resource that the chainsaw can farm. The 5-star resources are all the ones that the chainsaw is exceptional at getting. The 4-star resources are all great choices to be farmed with the chainsaw, but are not totally optimal. And the 3-star resources, while okay, are probably not the best thing to use a chainsaw for. The chainsaw is definitely not as good as the mining drill because the mining drill essentially farmed everything in the game besides meat, but it's arguably the best method for farming wood and organic polymer in the game, so you probably want to try it out. Tip 3 is about what creatures are best to bring along with you when you're farming by hand, and it varies based on what you're using and what resource you're going for. Just for context before I give examples to explain what I'm talking about, the 2 creatures you're going to have to decide between are an RG and a Percoptodon. First, here's an example where the RG would be far better. If you're using a chainsaw and going out to farm wood, and you're collecting a lot of it, you're going to over-encumber yourself almost immediately. It would be great to have an RG with you during this trip because you can just dismount off the RG, farm the tree, and put the heavy wood that you farmed into the RG for a weight reduction boost to keep your run going longer than it was before. On the contrary, if you're farming for element on the volcano in Gen 1, the Percoptodon is the obvious choice. Not only because obviously you can actually bring the creature onto the map, but because it's faster with the chain jumping than an Archentavis ever could dream of being, and you don't need the weight reduction because the mining drill does that for you. The most important reason why the Percoptodon is better is because you're able to use weapons on the back of it, so you're able to farm without having to dismount and get back on the creature. The Percoptodon can also have a really good weight stat if pumped properly, so it's a great choice because you're not going to get limited by the weight too badly. So yeah, the best creature to farm by hand with just depends on your situation, but the RG and the Procop are the best choices in my opinion. Number 4 is a lot more simple, and it's just to farm trilobites. Trilobites spawn everywhere around the beaches, and they drop chitin, oil, and silica pearls very commonly, and black pearls rarely. These creatures give you so many useful resources for the early game. Chitin is necessary for early game saddles that are super important like Pteranodon saddles, silica pearls are great for early game electronics or Spino saddles, and oil is useful throughout the entirety of the playthrough. Black pearls are also one of the toughest resources to get on certain maps, so it's really useful to get them from these really easy to kill creatures. At number 5, I have how to level points into your farming dinos. You might think this is extremely straightforward, but there's a few caveats that make it a little interesting. So for actual resource harvesting creatures like Ankies or Dodix, you just want to pump melee damage. If you're doing an auto harvesting strategy, maybe you want to put some weight into it so it doesn't get as inconvenient for you when it stops swinging at half weight, but in my opinion, you should just pump melee damage the entire time. If you're talking about a flying creature which carries your farmers around, for example an RG, a Quetzal, or a Rhino Ignatha, you want to pump weight mostly, but you also want to pump some stamina. You don't want to have to land a million times while you're flying around, but weight is the most important stat here by far. If you have any auto harvesting creatures, like for example a beaver that's going to get you wood while you're not at your base, you'd rather pump weight instead of damage because you don't really care how fast it's farming the wood, you'd rather it just have more wood when you actually check its inventory. And last but not least, if you have a Karkinos that you're farming with, just pump it so it has a bunch of HP and can't die. Pumping weight or stamina is completely irrelevant here because you don't need weight to pick up and throw the harvesting creature that you're using, and you don't need stamina because all you're doing is throwing the creature, jumping over, and standing next to it while it harvests for you. Number 6 is to use an RG for almost every farming application. I know a lot of people like to argue the Rhino Ignatha or the Quetzal is better for farming. That's just simply not the case. You can at least make an argument for the Rhino Ignatha because it's around the same speed as the RG when carrying stuff after they nerfed it a couple of years back, and it has good stats, so it's very strong when you're farming, but I just prefer the RG. It's easier to get in the early game, has better weight reductions, has a smithy on its saddle, and is way more maneuverable around rocks because you can actually see what you're doing. The Quetzal is completely ruled out for this argument because it is way too slow. For creatures like farming with a mammoth, which is great for wood, of course you would rather use a rhino because it can actually carry the thing, but for every application where you can carry it on both creatures, I would opt with the RG personally. If you want to argue that the Rhino Ignatha is the best flying farmer in the game because it can carry Magmasaurs, I will accept that. I get it. I think the Magmasaur is really good too, but I personally think the RG is just so much more convenient, so that's what I side with. Next, let's talk about what the best metal farmer in the game is, yet again excluding the Strider, because the Strider is always the best for everything because it is broken. The two contestants here are the Anki and the Magmasaur. To get this out of the way first, if you put these two at sheer numbers, the Magmasaur is better. It farms more metal per rock than the Anki. With that being said, there's a lot of pros to using the Anki instead of the Magmasaur in terms of convenience and just application. If you're on Aberration, for example, the Carcanos can't grab a Magmasaur, so it's obviously better to use the Anki, and an Anki farming on Aberration beats a Magmasaur farming anywhere in the game. The Anki is definitely a more versatile farmer, as more creatures can carry it, it can be used in more applications, and it's just able to farm a lot more of a variety of resources than the Magmasaur can. In terms of sheer metal farming though, they're both excellent. At number 8, let's talk about how good the Mosschops is. The Mosschops farms the following resources insanely efficiently: organic polymer, rare flowers, rare mushrooms, sap, leash blood, raw prime meat, and raw prime fish meat. For how early in the game you can get the Mosschops, it farms a lot of really high value resources very effectively. In its radial menu, you can increase the harvesting levels on the resources I just listed, and it'll farm more of those resources as a result of doing this. For example, if you want this Mosschops to farm an insane amount of organic polymer, go to its radial menu, increase the harvesting level for polymer, and it'll get so much more. If you get a ton of melee points onto a Mosschops and then max the harvesting levels for one resource, it's pretty much impossible to beat. My next piece of advice is to use the Therizino for a bunch of different farming applications in the game, and it kind of falls under a more overarching point of not needing the perfect creature for every job in terms of farming. First, let me explain why the Therizino is so amazing, and then I'll get into that overarching point afterwards. The Therizino has two different harvesting types: power and delicate harvesting. Both of these are incredibly powerful in different ways. The power harvesting is better for when you're using the main attack to farm. So for example, if you're farming for wood or meat, you're going to want to level power harvesting. Delicate harvesting covers everything else, so it's whenever you use the tickle finger attack or the C attack. This is for when you're gathering fiber, hide, organic polymer, berries, or other things like rare flowers or rare mushrooms. You can upgrade these two farming methods in your radial menu just like the Mosschops, and it's insanely useful to be able to spec your creature into one of these two paths. The Theri is exceptional at farming all 8 resources I mentioned earlier, so it's definitely a must tame for farming in the game. The Theri is the perfect example of not needing the perfect creature for the job because it's so versatile that there's no reason not to tame it. Taming a Theri to cover 8 of the resources that you need to farm inside of the game is much more time efficient than getting 8 different creatures and leveling them all and mutating them all and breeding them all and doing all the work for all of them. Why not just put all the effort into one Theri line, get an insane Theri, and maybe it's not 100% optimal, but maybe it's 85% optimal for every single one of those resources. That's way better than spending all the time going through 8 different individual lines. You could even take this a step further and look at Theris as a great boss fight creature and say, oh wow, I have a bunch of melee mutations on my Theri, why don't I just use this for the boss fight? And that saves you even more time. This specific advice is of course not for everybody because some people like to try to tame everything and get optimized lines and everything for fun, which I totally respect, but this is for people that are looking to min-max it or just optimize their time while they're playing through the game. At tip 10, I have using the auto harvest feature on farming creatures. Creatures like the Anki, Dodic, and Beaver can auto farm nearby nodes for specific resources, and this can be very useful especially if you don't have the saddle for that creature yet. Ankis can auto harvest metal nodes, Dodics can auto harvest rocks for stone, and Beavers can auto harvest trees for wood. Yet again, these are just a couple of examples. There's a ton of creatures in Ark that can auto harvest resources for you. If you're trying to farm as a solo player, you can also put these creatures onto auto harvest and fly over nodes with them under you. This will actually let them swing at resources for you, and it's extremely convenient if you don't have a friend to swing for you. The downside to this is that if the farming creature is at 50% weight, it will no longer harvest any more resources, so it's limited to how much you can do substantially because the farming creatures have far worse weight than the flyers you're riding on. It also is insanely buggy and always has been, so I personally opt for just getting off the flyer, hitting the rock on the farmer, and then getting back onto the flyer to go to the next patch of rocks. This way of doing resource runs is a bit slower, but it's a lot more consistent, and you get way more out of each trip you take. Slot capping with an Anki when you're using a Karkinos, or simply getting to the max weight of an RG, Rhino, or Quetzal is so much more per trip than using half the weight of an Anki, and the fly speed of these other farmers is really slow, so it's much better to get more per trip and go a little bit slower during the trip. Number 11 is using the Mantis more. The Mantis is incredibly good at farming a few high tier resources in the game if you put a great pickaxe into its inventory. Just for clarity for people that don't know this, the Mantis does hold 2 of the same weapon in its hand, so if you put 1 pickaxe in, it'll visually have 2, but it's not like you put 2 pickaxes in, so you only need 1 good pick and a great melee Mantis to farm insanely well. The best application for the Mantis's high farming potential is definitely farming element veins. Its biggest downside in terms of farming is its lack of weight reductions, which is why the Anki and Magma Spore are better choices for farming metal than it, but it's truly exceptional at farming element from these veins. The best way to farm an element vein with a Mantis is to farm the outer nodes and then the inner node, because if you do it in the reverse order by farming the inner node first, it will destroy the outer nodes before you get the element from those. At number 12, I have how to use the Karkinos most effectively. The Karkinos is insanely broken if you know how to use it right. The perk to using the Karkinos over any other farming carrier is that it's stronger than the other ones, and it doesn't have a weight stat because you can throw the over encumbered Anki with no concern for weight. The best spot to use the Karkinos in is on Aberration in the blue zone to farm metal with an Anki. There's 2 ways to go about this. If you're in single player, you need to have a farming base down in the blue zone near where you farm until you get a teleporter or a transmitter so you can actually bring that heavy amount of loot back up to your base. And if you're in multiplayer, all you have to do is have a transmitter down there so you can transfer off the server with a slot cap of loot. For using the Karkinos throw most effectively, it is all about where you're looking. If you're looking down, it'll throw it straight out in front of you, and if you're looking up, it'll chuck it really high up in the air and forward. The Anki will always have a horizontal acceleration regardless of where you're looking, so be careful when you throw this and take some practice shots before you get into the dangerous area. One more important thing I should note before I get to the next point is that you shouldn't take the metal out of the Anki's inventory until you're ready to either transfer it with a transmitter or put it into your resource base that's in the blue zone already. If your Anki is over encumbered and you take the metal out, you can't put it back in the Anki, and then you're screwed because you can't put the metal on the Karkinos either, because if the Karkinos has too much metal on it, it can't jump around. The only reason this strategy is so effective is because the Karkinos can throw things when it's encumbered, so it can throw the Anki when it's fully encumbered, but if it has too much metal on it, it won't be able to jump over to where it threw the Anki, and then you are completely out of luck. My 13th tip is using the whip because in my opinion, it's the best farming tool inside of the entirety of Ark. Although the whip is a decent option for farming silica pearls, that's not why I'm saying it's great for farming. I'm saying it because it is the best option in the game for relocating resources. Here are the best applications for the whip when you're farming. To show just how OP the whip is, let's go back to that Karkinos and Anki example that I was talking about before. Let's say you're farming an Aberration in the blue zone, and your Anki is fully slot capped on metal. The best way to get this metal into your inventory and back to your base is one of 2 things. If you're going back to a resource base, for example if you have a resource base in the blue zone, the best way to transport this metal is throwing the Anki over to the base, and then using a whip to accurately relocate the encumbered Anki to where you need it, then popcorn it out, and then whip the popcorned metal that you threw out of the Anki's inventory so it is all in your inventory, and then you place it into the crafting station you need. You could also do this with a transmitter. If you're trying to get off the map with a transmitter, you jump off the Anki after popcorning, and then you get next to the transmitter and then whip the metal that you popcorned. Grabbing this popcorned metal lets you upload your character with the metal, spawn back at your base with all the metal on you, and then the metal is back at your base wherever it is on any map. At number 14, I have how to farm with a raft effectively. Farming with the raft is really valuable inside of Ark in some applications because the raft doesn't have a weight stat, so you can have as much weight on it as you need. A great example for this is if you bring a mammoth into the swamp and you're on a raft, you can farm all the trees there for an insane amount of wood with zero worry at all. This is of course a really niche thing because a lot of areas on the map just don't allow you to reach with a raft, so you can't use it for everything, but when you can use it, it is insanely valuable. Tip 15 is all about organic polymer. I know I've already mentioned a few ways to farm polymer earlier in this video, including the moss shops and the chainsaw, but the Pelagornis may just be the best in the entire game at farming this resource. Here's why. First of all, the Pelagornis farms a really high amount of polymer per kill on penguins, which is very efficient. It also is equipped with an 80% weight reduction for organic polymer that's in its inventory, so you can carry a ton with you. The Pelagornis being a flyer is also a big convenience boost, and it being able to attack Kairuku that are swimming on the surface of the water by sitting on top of it and attacking down is really convenient to farm those annoying penguins. Once you farm a ton of organic polymer, you can convert it into soap by cooking it with oil, and then grind the soap back down with an industrial grinder to get the polymer back later when you actually need it. Organic polymer is very convenient to be able to farm, but the low stack size and quick spoil time make people usually not use it. This preservation method makes organic polymer even better than it already is. Another useful resource that's perishable in Ark is honey. Let's talk about how to farm it first, and then I'll teach you how to preserve it. The best way to farm honey in Ark in 2025 is to go to Ark and farm it in the bee cave at 46.1.11.3. In the back of this cave, there's a ton of beehives that you can farm with an Anki or a pickaxe to get as much honey as you would ever need. If you're not on Astraeos and you're looking for another way to farm honey, go to the redwoods on any map and you'll find them. On Extinction, they're in the sanctuary most commonly. Once you find a beehive, the best way to harvest it is using a Dire Bear's alt attack. This attack makes the bees not aggro to you, so you're safe from them, and gives you a ton more than you would get by just manually farming it by yourself. I'd also recommend making yourself a passive bee farm. In order to get this bee farm started, you need to destroy a beehive and then passively tame the giant queen bee that spawns after you destroy it. The best way to tame it is using simple kibble. All you need is one simple kibble to tame it up, and it's so much more efficient than going out to farm it every time. The best way to preserve honey in the entire game is putting it onto a fishing rod. When a honey is on fishing rod, it doesn't spoil because it's considered to be an ammo type for the fishing rod, so it's extremely effective to preserve it in this method. There's other ways you can preserve it, of course, but this is by far the best. One more tip involving paid DLC is using the Dreadmare if you have it. The Dreadmare is insanely useful for transporting things back to base. Here's a good example for this. The Dreadmare has one ability that makes it really good for transporting, the Pocket Dimension. If you put a creature into the Dreadmare's pocket dimension, for example a slot-capped Anki, you'll be able to carry that Anki with the items in its inventory still inside the Dreadmare for zero cost of weight. This is by far the most effective way to transport heavy amounts of resources on maps where flyers are allowed. The Dreadmare's Black Hole, aka Pocket Dimension ability, works on a drag weight system, so you don't actually have to worry about what weight is on the creature you're picking up at all. It's just about the drag weight of the creature. Drag weight is a stat that Ark uses to determine what creatures are allowed in, for example, boss arenas, or for example, what creatures can carry what other creatures. It's all based on drag weight. It's never really based on the actual weight of the creature, and that applies to the Black Hole for the Dreadmare as well. Pumping weight on the Dreadmare directly increases the max drag weight capacity for your Black Hole ability, so that's what I would pump for the Dreadmare for sure, because its glide gives you stamina efficient travel anyway. At number 18, I have making an Ovis farm. The Ovis drops mutton, hide, and pelt when killed, so it's very useful to have on hand in case you ever need mutton quickly or in case you just need to top up on hide or pelt. To actually get your first 2 Ovis to start the farm, you do need to get sweet veggie cakes, which are a pain in the ass to make, requiring giant bee honey, sap, rock carrots, long grass, savroot, stimulant, fiber, and water in a cooking pot. But once you get them and you get enough for 2 Ovis, I would highly recommend you spend your first couple veggie cakes getting this farm started. At number 19, I have the best way to get oil, because there's actually a handful of ways you can get oil inside of the game. The first and most obvious way is just to farm oil underwater with the Dunkleosteus, which is a great method of actively farming it, and the Dunkleosteus is an insanely underrated creature for underwater farming in general, but I don't prefer doing this if you're able to use oil pumps on the map you're playing on. Of course, if you're on something like the island, you're going to have to use the Dunkleosteus, go down and farm the oil, because it's the best method by far of getting it, besides oil pumps. But if there is oil pump locations on the map that you can use, oil pumps will produce enough oil for you that you'll never need to go manually farm it again. Another way to get oil is to passively produce it inside of a Basilosaurus or a Tuzotoothes' inventory. These two creatures passively produce oil over time, but they do have a hard cap of 20 oil in the Basilosaurus' inventory at a time and 70 in the Tuzo's inventory at a time. So you're definitely going to have to use a separate method on top of this if you want to get enough oil to play through the game. The last passive farm I'm going to talk about in this video is making an Achatina farm for cementing paste. Achatina farms can be really productive for a couple of reasons. First is it's yet again another passive way to farm resources in the game, which is super valuable because of how many resources you need to farm in total. Snails are super easy to tame in the early game, so you can get this farm going from right at the start. A way to enhance your Achatina farm would be to have a gacha with you. If you have a gacha in your farm, it'll actually passively pick up the cementing paste. If you put some low tier structures like wood, thatch, or stone structures in its inventory, for example stone ceilings, it's a great choice because the gacha will eat that as opposed to eating your cementing paste, and then you don't have to actually go and manually pick up the cementing paste that's being produced in your farm. The two other ways to farm cementing paste are just using a frog and going to kill bugs inside of a cave, and using a megatherium to go farm chitin inside of a cave, and then crafting that with stone to make cementing paste through a chem bench. Using the frog to directly harvest cementing paste from creatures is much easier than doing the megatherium and crafting the cementing paste, but they're both great choices. You will need to do one of these two methods at some point, because the Achatina farm, while being very useful to have, isn't going to give you enough cementing paste for an entire playthrough because you need so much of it throughout the entire game. Tip number 21 is using the Dunkleosteus and underwater farming more often. The Dunkleosteus is great for underwater farming of all types. It collects metal and oil extremely effectively, and can also farm obsidian, crystal, flint, and black pearls pretty well. The Dunkleosteus is of course not as good as the angler for black pearls, but it's still pretty good, and it's a very versatile creature, so you definitely want to get a good Dunkleosteus. As a nice kicker, the Dunkleosteus has some nice weight reductions and a really solid weight stat in its own right, and it also is the best method of farming on certain maps like the center, where underwater farming is the meta. Speaking of black pearls are a pain in the ass to farm on certain maps. On maps like Ragnarok, Astraeos, and Aberration, you can easily farm a ton of black pearls by just collecting them, but on other maps such as the island, you need to kill creatures for them. There's 6 creatures that drop black pearls: Tuzos, Alpha Mosas, Trilobites, and the 2 variants of seafloor creatures, the Ammonite and the Sea Scorpion. The seafloor dwellers are good for farming black pearls because they spawn on repeat as long as you stay down towards the bottom of the ocean, and killing Tuzos, Alpha and Alpha Mosas can be extremely efficient if you're strong enough to do so. Trilobites barely drop any, so even though they are safe, I wouldn't recommend farming them in that way. I'd use a Xiphactinus or Megalodon pack with the Basilosaurus as your main mount for farming the higher tier creatures, and if you're farming the creatures at the bottom of the ocean, the Baryonyx does harvest the most black pearls from those creatures, but a Baryonyx is pretty dangerous down there just because it can get stunned, and there is a ton of eels at the bottom of the ocean, so either be careful using a berry or use something that's stun immune. The only problem that the Sea Scorpions and the Ammonites can cause is the high torpor that they deal, so as long as you were paying attention to that, you'll be fine. My next tip is about how to optimally loot beaver dams and drops around the map. Whenever you loot things around the map like beaver dams, regular drops, or cave drops, don't just take what you need and leave the rest behind. Dispose of the items you don't want. For example, if you need rare flowers and cementing paste and you're farming for beaver dams to get it, after grabbing the paste and flowers, drop the rest of the items that are in the dam so that a new one can spawn elsewhere to provide more useful resources in the future. This is most important for dams because leaving dams around that are just holding wood is super useless. For cave drops and normal drops is not as important, but you might as well do it. Especially if you're trying to get blueprints from cave drops, you might as well drop all the items out of the cave drop so another one can spawn faster, especially if you're sitting there and waiting for new ones to spawn until you get the blueprint you're looking for. My 24th tip is to start growing berries. As you may have noticed throughout this video, passive farming in Ark is really strong because there's a limited amount of resources that you can actually passively farm for. So taking those opportunities when you get them is something that I always recommend, especially if you're a solo player. If you're in a huge tribe, it's always better to just go out and do another run because it's technically faster to do a run than to wait for a passive farm, but this is not the case for most players. Berry farming produces 300 berries per day if you have an optimal setup, so having a couple of crop plots set up is way better than just manually farming every time you need berries. Brontos are the best for manually farming berries in the game because of their huge AoE and their great weight stat to actually carry a bunch of berries back to your base, but in my opinion, you should just grow a bunch of Tinto berries and Narco berries because the rest aren't super useful. I'm going to split tip 25 into 2 parts, and they're both just general advice for farming. First is to use online resource maps to find good locations for loot that are near your base whenever you need. This is extremely convenient and I highly recommend doing it. A video like this going through every resource location just isn't practical, and it's way more useful if I give you general advice. So using something like Ark Unity is great because you can actually just see where everything is on the map in relation to where you are, and it's very, very helpful. My second general piece of advice is to transfer to other maps for resources if you're able to. It's exponentially more efficient to do so in a lot of cases. For example, if you go to Aberration to get metal in the blue zone, you're going to save so much time in comparison to if you just chose to go to the island mountains and farm metal that way. It's not even close. Well, that's my list. If you want to see a video on me showing off every auto farm inside of Ark and how to build it most efficiently, I'd be happy to do so if you leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this resource farming guide, I guarantee you that you'll enjoy the video on screen now where I listed off 25 things you should start doing inside of Ark. I'll see you there. Peace!